This podcast episode was made possible in part with support from Sacred Rights, a project funded by the Henry Luce Foundation and the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation and hosted by Northeastern University. Sacred Rights is a project that supports public scholarship on religion and provides resources and networks for scholars of religion committed to translating the significance of their research to a broader audience. I recommend you learn more about Sacred Rights on their website at sacred-rights.org or find Sacred Rights on Twitter at sacred_rights. Thank you so much for joining me. This is Greg Soden. On this episode, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Lauren Horn Griffin. Lauren Horn Griffin received her PhD at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and is an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Louisiana State University. On this episode, we discuss her first book, Fabricating Founders in Early Modern England, which was released via Brill in 2023. And then we discuss her current project investigating contemporary negotiations of national, religious, and racial identities in Catholic communities online. Adding Catholicism to current conversations about what many are calling white Christian nationalism in the U.S., she shows that while Catholics have long imagined the nation in terms of religious identity, many currently mobilize ideas of Catholic tradition to construct images of a multinational white Western civilization. We conclude our conversation by discussing her goals within public-facing scholarship. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Lauren Horn Griffin. Dr. Lauren Horn Griffin, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Thanks for having me.
I'm delighted that you're here. I'm wondering if we can start off a little bit today by having you introduce yourself a little bit to the listeners out there so they know a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, I am an assistant professor of religious studies at Louisiana State University. This is my second year on the tenure track at LSU. And before that, I was an instructor at the University of Alabama. So here at LSU, I research and teach about religion, technology, media, and politics.
Wonderful. Well, I noticed that you did your PhD at the University of California in Santa Barbara, and I'm wondering a little bit about your backstory, a little bit about your academic path, and some of your personal, turning points along the way to kind of help you find your areas of interest and academic expertise over the years.
Yeah, so I have a broad range of interests that are sort of unified by my interest, my original interest in Catholic studies. So I went to Santa Barbara because I was interested in Catholic studies and kind of the history of Christianity. As a young green grad student, I thought that I came in hoping to find answers for why our world looks the way it does today. And I thought that history might help me contextualize some of that. And what I quickly found was that I started looking back in American history and then to European history in the early modern period as sort of like the cause for some of this stuff. And I quickly learned that history doesn't really work like that. It's not a linear story of cause and effect, but
Yeah.
It was, it's a lot messier. And I learned theoretical concepts like genealogy and how things aren't sort of this like linear story. So I got interested in a lot of things and a lot of questions and social theory in particular. And so that really broadened my scope. And I'm still interested in questions of history and development, but also now interested in broader questions about identity and social theory.
Do you have any major memories and things that stand out in your mind about how you became invested in pursuing Catholic studies as a career?
Yeah, so I was as a kid, I was a Catholic growing up in the Protestant South, and so I had a lot of questions about why things were the way they were. And Protestant friends told me things and I'd be like, oh, that sounds worth investigating. And so middle school, Lauren was very interested in like sort of understanding the differences, denominational differences and the developments of that stuff. And then as I got older, my concerns changed. I wasn't as concerned with the things that I was concerned with initially, but I still had an interest in history and in Christian social identities and how they're sort of shaped and how they're fluid and how they're sometimes weird. And so I still was interested in all of that. So by the time I got to grad school, I was still really interested in the early modern period. And so I worked there and then ended up having my first kid at the end of my dissertation phase. And so I went on the job market. I actually got a job offer, and then it wasn't a good fit for my family at the time. I had a newborn, and I ended up moving back to my home state of Oklahoma and working in ed tech. Actually, I had two more kids and took time away from the job market, actually. So I was sort of thinking about technology and how platforms shape what we know at the time. And so I got really interested. But I still had my book manuscript that I wanted to publish because I had worked hard on it. But now I was interested in all these questions that are very structurally similar to my first book, as far as questions about nationalism, identity, shifts in media technologies. But now, instead of focusing on the early modern period, I was interested in how that's happening online. And I thought I had sort of left academia behind, but then COVID happened and I ended up getting a job at the University of Alabama because of my, skills and experience teaching online. And then that turned into my tenure track job at LSU. I applied and got this one. So it was kind of a weird in and out story for me, but it worked out.
I absolutely love that. I found that I had somewhat of a similar experience where I was in a PhD program myself, but then I left the PhD program and took a teaching job. And then because I left, I took all the skills that I had from academia, but then I fell into like my passion area, which is like world religions and religious studies in this other job. So it's like, getting out of one track into another track helped me find an interest that built on to the interest from the other area. And I just have so much a curiosity about how other people find their interests and their passions along the way, because mine's been so bumpy and weird and wonky along the way. You know what I mean?
Oh, totally. Same. And yeah, putting me out of my normal, like the thing I was trained to do really did force me to use my skills, like, and, sort of theoretical questions and analyses on other data, which was super helpful to like force me to like rethink things. And even though, yeah, as you said, my journey was kind of wonky, I'm really glad that that's what happened.
Yeah, me too. Okay, well, let's chat about a couple of your different projects. You mentioned a book manuscript a moment ago. This book manuscript has now been published and released by Brill as of 2023. So it's called Fabricating Founders in Early Modern England, History, Rhetoric, and the Origins of Christianity. And I'm wondering if you can just tell me a little bit about the origin of this manuscript and this particular project. Kind of take me back to the beginning and how this specific topic all started for you.
Yeah, so I was really interested in how English people were articulating themselves after the break with Rome. And so I was interested in how they had to, both Catholics and Protestants, everybody along that spectrum, had to go back and relook at medieval history and like use it for their own social purposes in the present, and how they did that, and to what social ends. And within early modern British history, there are particular like arguments and the ways in which Protestants have been portrayed and Catholics have been portrayed. So the book tries to sort of muddy those waters a little bit and show that it's a little bit more messy, while also really focusing in on this question of origin. So how Christianity came to England. They're all sort of trying to get to this pure original moment in order to say, well, this is how it started, so this is how we must do it now. And I find that these arguments are still really used in our own social worlds today by a variety of people. And so I found it really interesting that like they were doing the same thing, and this idea of going back to their medieval past and unpacking these pure origins to make English Christianity great again was just really familiar, but also really different. And I just thought it was a really interesting avenue to explore discourses on origins and how national identity was articulated in this early modern period.
So was this book derived from your original dissertation for your PhD?
Yes, it was. So I started becoming interested in early modern uses of medieval history in my PhD. So I focused in on origin narratives for the dissertation, and then to turn it into the book manuscript, I ended up drawing out a little bit more about how what I was really interested in was how these origin narratives are uniquely powerful rhetorical tools for the cultural production of national identity, both then and now. So since I wrote the diss and turned it into the manuscript, Christian nationalism has become a really popular paradigm for discussing contemporary articulations of religious nationalism, particularly in the US, but also elsewhere. So I was interested in that term and that sort of understanding. And so hopefully one of the things the book does is it shows that the cultural resources for nationalism have always been Christian. And indeed, during this period, because of breaks with Rome, these early nations had to articulate their identity in Christian terms. And so this affected the ways in which nationalism was articulated, moving forward in the US and elsewhere.
So thinking about that early modern time, like I'm wondering about what does everybody out there listening need to know about the arrival of Christianity in England post Rome? Because, it transforms the country as far as I can tell, and it has a long-term massive impact. But maybe we don't really know some of the specifics about the arrival of Christianity in the country itself.
Yeah, so there's several different narratives of how Christianity arrived in England that were from the Middle Ages. Probably the most dominant one, arguably, was that of Saint Augustine of Canterbury, who was sent by Gregory the Great to Christianize England, the Anglo-Saxons. So the story is that he comes, he converts King Ethelbert, and from there, the sort of regions of England are converted to Christianity. Protestants had a problem with this during the Reformation because it came from Rome, right? It was Catholic, and they needed to find the story goes that they needed to find Protestant, non-Catholic versions or different figures in the past to create a true Protestant past that was corrupted by these Roman Catholics. So that was sort of the narrative. And so what my book does is that it tries to show that the theological contests that among Protestants did indeed, shape English political culture, and it led to this distinct national identity. It was the debates themselves. It wasn't anything Protestant, but it was the fact that they had to articulate themselves. Both Protestants and Catholics had to produce and defend myths of Christian origins in England. The having to articulate over and over is what comprised this process of national identification. So it wasn't a particular Protestant or Catholic idea that produced and shaped English national consciousness, but it was having to re-articulate this story of its founding figures that served as the key driver for an ongoing sort of rhetorical production of a distinctly English national identity itself.
Tell me a little bit about what that looked like on the ground in the day-to-day life of the people of that national identity shaping in England in the 16th century. Kind of how does this play out on the ground in real life people?
Yeah, so the book looks at both printed and manuscript histories, as well as material culture. So I do try to think about how liturgy and material culture and saint shrines and place names, town names, things like rocks and trees that were named after founder saints like Augustine. I try to think about, how people on the ground just encountering that stuff every day, it just sort of instilled an Englishness, an idea of Englishness, right, in them. So having to do liturgical plays and doing having your town named after the founder saint of your area, and encountering these things that littered the landscape that you don't even think about today just kind of reinforces this idea of Englishness, and how that identity is just sort of scattered throughout the landscape. And so sometimes scholars would talk about regional versus national identity as if they're competing always, and how maybe more locally people were more invested in their regional identities, and maybe the printed histories focus more on national. But what I found is that the regional identities really strengthened articulations of national identity, right? So as antiquarians are going throughout the countryside, sort of writing down what they're finding, and mapping out the landscape, I found that a strong regional identity really bolstered a national identity. So we could think of analogous, to make an analogy for now, like strong Southern identities, for example, in the US, often bolster a strong nationalist sense. So these things aren't always in competition. So that's what I found on the ground. That's kind of one of the conversations I was trying to disrupt, was this idea that it's not always regional versus national, but that they can work together.
That's so interesting about Englishness too, because I used to live in England about 10 or 12 years ago. And the idea of Englishness is a debate and a conversation that is still happening very much to this day. Like, this is not a conversation that has gone away. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, totally. Exactly. Well, and that's another point of the book, is that oftentimes we focus on these things as articulations of national identity as unifying media, and it's not necessarily unifying. So when I'm saying that all of these debates forced them to articulate Englishness, which then bolstered a national sentiment, it doesn't mean that it bolstered unity or homogeneity or anything like that, just as it doesn't today in England or even the US, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that we're united or not polarized, or however you want to say, but it does mean that it keeps national identity at the forefront, right? It keeps it going, really. Even if we're not agreeing on what the content of it is, it keeps the nation as the point of departure.
So the book also does a really good deep dive into the idea of like miracles and the supernatural. And I'm wondering if you can just talk about that a little bit as well, because that section of the book is really captivating.
Chapter 3 really focuses on how shifts in articulation of supernatural involvement kind of relate to some of these questions about the articulation of national identity. So one of the sort of party lines of early modern historical scholarship has been that Catholics retained this sense of an enchanted world and magic and miracles, while Protestants moved from that, like, it changed to a more from immanence to a more transcendent version of God, and different ways in which they imagine God working in the world, right? So people often will say the Catholic world was like very enchanted, full of saints and miracles that they would perform and all of this stuff, whereas Protestants sort of did away with that stuff. What I tried to show in chapter 3 was that maybe we've overstated the difference between Catholic and Protestant understandings of the past by highlighting the miracles in the Catholic narratives. And that's not to deny the differences in Reformed thinking, nor to like downplay the studies that show how Catholics did retain beliefs in the supernatural in the face of legal and social challenges. But by taking a broader view and considering that actors from across that confessional spectrum, even Protestants, right, still really used ideas of supernatural intervention to authorize certain narratives for purposes in the present. So by looking at that bigger picture and thinking about the ways that Protestant writers indeed still really relied on supernatural intervention, though changed to authorize their historical narratives, we can see how we still do this today, right? So it functions really similarly, whether you take a more immanent or transcendent view or a broader view of even universal ideas. We still today even marshal those arguments to legitimize our stuff. I'm thinking even a couple of summers ago, I wrote about how Alito, in his Supreme Court case where they overturned Roe, one of his things was to go back to 17th century England to talk about our, quote, deeply rooted tradition of this idea about life and conception and all of that stuff. So even in Alito's thing, he's in this, quote, secular government, in the secular document, right, we might say, he's still really constructing this sort of universalizing transcendent idea of tradition, capital T tradition, right, using the early modern past for his purposes in the present. He's doing a structurally similar thing. So my hope in that section, rethinking how Catholics and Protestants are talking about supernatural intervention, is to show that even though there was indeed shifts in thinking about supernatural activity, it functioned remarkably similarly in historical narratives, in that it was used to authorize and legitimize.
In our conversations and communications, like before we did this interview, something that really struck me was the way that you kind of described yourself almost as like a split academic personality, because you have this deep interest in the early modern period, but you're also interested in the here and now. And I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about your shift and your own interests from the early modern period to focusing on today, and also your focus on like online dialogue and discourse in the world today. I'm just really curious to hear the story about your shift over.
Yeah. So if this first book, right, focused on how Catholics sort of rewrote the medieval past to sort of negotiate these national and religious identities, I followed that interest in thinking about how Catholic communities are producing tradition now online, right? So if I'm interested in how they were doing it in the early modern period, I was kind of interested in how they're using how Catholics today were using the early modern period online. So I wrote a little article about how US Catholics were using images of medieval and early modern Europe on Twitter to manufacture ideas of Western civilization for purposes in the present. So I was asking those same questions about the production of tradition, a production of national identity, and employing that same media analysis as the first project. I had just accidentally become interested in the digital space and how that shaped, how digital hyperconnectivity shaped all of this so differently. So yeah, I couldn't be pursuing these, I find exciting new directions in my research without the historical context that the first book provided. But my job in ed tech really helped me ask new questions about these same themes, right? Like how the fact of our all-encompassing digital media shapes all of this so differently. So those are the kind of the questions I'm interested in right now.
Okay, so let's talk about the traditionalist Catholic movement that you have documented. I was enjoying reading some of your work about this. Let's start with something like super basic. Tell listeners out there a little bit about the traditionalist Catholic movement and how they form in the United States.
Yeah. So one of the things my article tries to do is tries to say, is this really a movement? Is it really a cohesive thing? But typically the term traditionalist Catholic has been used to refer to Catholics who preferred the liturgy and social teaching of the church before what they see as the sort of modernizing reforms of Vatican II, which was the Second Vatican Council, which was a big meeting of bishops in the 1960s. These Catholics are often talked about as preferring that stuff from before the changes of the 1960s, right? So going again, this theme of going back to something purer and truer, right? And so that's often how they're talked about. Sometimes the radical is added to identify those who go further in their reaction or rejection to Vatican II, sometimes rejecting things like the authority of the Pope. Sometimes certain groups split altogether. There are other groups that have like a ambiguous relationship with the official Catholic authorities that are like not totally excommunicated or out, but like are everybody kind of looks at askance, you might say. Now, wrapped up in all of this, groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center have labeled radical traditional Catholics as anti-Semitic and anti-democratic, and sometimes as hate groups, and that those themes are certainly present in some content from rad trads online, but because the term rad trad sounds fun and got kind of memeified, now it's like confusing. So people are like, oh, so now I think maybe in the 1990s, if you'd have talked about radical traditionalist Catholicism, most people might not have known what that even was, or most people would have just thought, oh, it's this sort of anti-Semitic, very right-wing wing of Catholicism. But now it's a little bit messier. And it really is, rad trad really is a product of the internet. So it's weird. It's hard to talk about these relationships because it really is a product of now, but also definitely obviously connected to these events that happened before.
You mentioned just now coherence, if it's a coherent movement. I'm curious about the demographics of what you know about the modern traditional Catholics in the US. Like, is it coherent? Like, I'm just curious about who is out there and what they're doing.
Yeah, no, it's not coherent. I would say no. So we don't have good data on this stuff, but there is at least a perception that this attraction to traditional liturgy and social teaching is growing. So Pope Francis has tried to address this a little bit by cracking down on the traditional Latin Mass. So this is Mass in Latin. Again, Vatican II changed, allowed Mass to be said in vernacular languages. So he tried cracking down on this a little bit, which just caused more of a reaction in reverse. So there's certainly a perception that this is growing, particularly amongst younger Catholics. So college organizations and young families, but there's no hard data on like how many are attending and is it really growing, or is this just kind of an internet sensation?
Are there any like famous or well-known figures that people out there might know who could fall into the silo of traditionalist Catholic or radical traditionalist Catholic that we might know, be able to see on TV and stuff like that every day?
So there's been some like flirtations with it. Probably one major figure on, a big right-wing provocateur personality is Nick Fuentes of America First. So he was in the news a while back when he had dinner with Trump. Anyway, so he's like a big influencer on the far right. That is definitely like all of his content is traditionalist Catholic, and he is explicitly anti-Semitic and anti-democratic. So he's like probably a big name. Other people that kind of there's also though on what some call like the dirty left or left, sometimes leftist podcasts like Red Scare will often flirt with like the far right, folks like Steve Bannon. So sometimes far leftists will get into sort of this traditionalist. They'll be attracted to this traditionalist liturgy and going back to something truer, rejecting the kind of cringe guitar style praise and worship stuff of contemporary churches that like, so it's really a varied movement with different figures, definitely not a singular thing that we can sort of point to.
Something that I'm wondering about is how the traditionalist Catholics might be like differentiating themselves or aligning themselves with modern conservative Protestants. Like if they are, I'm wondering what those differences or their or collaborations might be like across these different groups in the US.
Yeah, so there definitely is collaborations sometimes. A big influencer on Twitter. This kind of as Twitter wanes, it's less so. But this guy Taylor Marshall, he's probably the largest trad influencer on Twitter. He they'll team up when it's politically advantageous, certainly, but they also will definitely quibble amongst each other, and then even within Catholicism, even within Catholic Twitter, even within trad Catholic Twitter, there's like feuds and enemies and frenemies and all of that stuff. So, for example, Taylor Marshall and Eric Metaxas and others collaborated on a march a couple of years ago. And Trump, Catholics for Trump was a thing that a lot of trad Twitter participated in during the last election. So they'll certainly, different events and contexts will form new boundaries and new affinities, right? So it's fluid and it's contextual, and so sometimes they team up and sometimes they don't. And not all trads are right wing, right? Some say that Trump isn't right enough, right? And they go further into the world of the alt-right. Others are, I came across a tweet by a guy that was like, I'm just trying to watch a Latin mass on YouTube, not, donate to Mitch McConnell's campaign, because he was seeing this algorithmic connection that the internet really connected these two. And he was like, there's a lot of people who just prefer the Latin mass and prefer traditional piety, who don't want, who are either leftist or don't want to engage in contemporary Trump movement. So it really is a varied and confusing little internet moment.
You just mentioned AI and algorithms a little bit, and there's another piece that you sent me recently that was really that I was really interested in from Religion Dispatch. Is called "Like the Bible, You'll Love a Let's Go Brandon T-shirt: How AI Marketing Shapes Identity." And I'm wondering if you can talk to me a little bit about what you're noticing with AI and algorithms, and how you, as a scholar with your interests, are getting involved in exploring that realm with regards to religion and spirituality in the United States today.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested in algorithmic culture and how machine learning affects identity formation. One of the points in that piece, and that I also make in the RadTrad piece, is that it's not only algorithms and computation, but also the way people imagine and perceive algorithms and computation that shape the way we think about ourselves and our communities. And they also shape the way that people think about, quote, the media itself. And it sort of raises concerns about, democracy in the digital age. So in the Let's Go Brandon piece, I talked about how there was a pastor who was upset by upon going to a Bible website, finding an advertisement for a Let's Go Brandon t-shirt, which is Let's Go Brandon being a code for insulting President Biden. So he was upset by this. And he was like, oh, the internet thinks that like Christians are connected to, Let's Go Brandon-y type, sentiments or movements. And he was like upset by this. And so the comments were sort of like working through this, like, oh, that wasn't the Bible, the Bible app didn't platform that ad. Like you must have searched for something, your algorithm must be, drawing it in. And he's like, no, I'm not right wing. So basically it was all these people trying to figure out how cookies work or how like an AI marketing works. And what became clear was that this is now a player, right? This is now a conversation partner in this game, and in this acts of identification for folks, right? So there's a lot of discussions about how the algorithm works and if it's correct and if big media, big tech is pulling strings like so it causes a lot of distrust in media. I found on TikTok and my research on trad women veiling on TikTok that they'll often interpret the algorithm as theistic communication. So they'll say, well, if I'm meant to veil, God will bring it back to me through the algorithm, things like that. There's lots of different ways that people talk about it, either correctly or incorrectly, and think about it. But it's clear that that the algorithm as a thing and as an idea is shaping these conversations.
That is so interesting. I really hope that you keep going with that work too, because that article was really interesting to me. So I hope that you keep staying involved in that realm so you can bring us some more good reading on that topic. So I'm curious about your involvement with the Sacred Rights program. Tell me a little bit about your involvement with what you're doing with Sacred Rights.
Yeah, so as I started to publish a few pieces on trads and trad activity online, scholars started to invite me to like provide analysis of Catholic digital media at conferences and public talks and Zoom panels. I started being drawn into conversations about what many are calling, quote, Christian nationalism, which is a concept that I sort of treat critically. And then I started getting calls from journalists to like I've commented for a couple of publics for Slate and some other local newspapers who are interested in trads. I produced a podcast episode about it. So as I started to get these more public opportunities, I was like, man, I could really use some training in how to think about this more clearly, because this was sort of new for me. It turns out people weren't as interested in what Catholics in the 16th century were doing as they are interested in what Catholics online are doing now, which makes sense. So yeah, I applied to Sacred Rights to try to get some training on thinking about public scholarship, because yeah, what felt like overnight, my voice had become more public than I had anticipated, and I was still kind of figuring out how to negotiate that aspect of scholarly life.
That's amazing. How do you feel yourself growing the most so far because of the opportunities and the trainings that you've gone through with the program?
One thing it really helped me do was connect my teaching and research to my public scholarship. So a lot of public scholarship is really pedagogical, right? It's the same sort of thing that we're doing in the classroom, sort of walking people through complex ideas that I've had the time to think a lot about, but maybe you haven't. Thinking about how I do that in the classroom and how I can do that in my public writing, and how you don't have to dumb ideas down, but I have, spent a lot of time with this material. So I do have to think about communicating it differently to people who haven't spent a lot of time with this material. So it's really helped me articulate what I'm doing, and actually I find that public writing really energizes me, because it's a, working on an article and going through rounds of peer review and conversations and edits, and it's a long process and it takes a long time for that payoff. But what can be really nice about public writing is that you focus yourself down on a little piece. You think about how you can be as clear and as interesting as possible, and doing that and then having that published and sort of out in the world is like, yeah, okay, I did, like it's really energizing, so that you can go back to the slog that academic writing can sometimes be and be like, okay, I can do this here too. So it really helps me just drawing connections between all of them, and thinking about how I'm articulating my ideas.
I love the fast payoff so much about podcasting because I love being able to have conversations like this and then have it come out not a year from now. You know what I mean?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it has that like, oh, I have something to say about this current event right now. So let me, like, let's go Brandon or something, which is already sort of not as much of a saying as it was a couple of years ago. So like having something to say right now and getting it out there. Yeah, exactly. Is a really nice payoff sometimes.
I'm wondering how you're feeling about like risks versus rewards, because like if I think about the particular community that you're writing about, like I did an episode of the podcast a while back about the woman priest movement within the Catholic Church, and it was some of the most fierce pushback I've ever gotten as a podcaster about that particular topic. And I'm wondering about how you're seeing those experiences within talking about what you talk about as far as like the risks versus the rewards of the work.
Yeah, I think that's definitely going to be something I encounter moving forward. Right now, a lot of my work is like, oh, look how messy this is. So I don't get as much pushback. So, for example, I wrote for the Uncivil Religion Project, which was a collaboration between the Smithsonian and the University of Alabama, sort of documenting the media from January 6th, 2021. Through that piece, they wanted me to write about like the Catholic presence on January 6th, and what the piece in that on that publication argued was that there is no profile for the Trump Catholic. There's no singular thing we can point to and say, oh, here they are, here's the profile, this is their demographic, this is why they're interested, this is what their beliefs are causing them to do, right? It says it's really not that. There's no easy answer for or easy articulation of Catholic support for Trump, right? It's local, sometimes individual, right? It's really messy. So when you start to argue, instead of pointing fingers and creating sort of boogeymen, my work is always like, oh, look how messy this is, or look how we sort of create certain groups out of online discourse that aren't really groups. So when you make those types of arguments, people don't push back as much because it's a lot of muddying the waters rather than offering clear answers.
What are some of your goals in the next like 3 to 5 years of your own scholarship and writing? Like, how do you see yourself being involved in the public sphere, but also in the academic sphere? Where are you going from here?
Yeah, so I'm working on my second book project called Trads, Catholicism, Nationalism, and the Production of Tradition in an Age of Hyperconnectivity. That is its working title. And so in that book, I'm really interested in using Trads as an example for how that meme word is an example of how digital hyperconnectivity has reshaped ourselves and our social worlds. So in that book, I explore transformations of the self, social communication, culture, and politics, all focusing on the example of the trads, but kind of asking this larger question about how digital hyperconnectivity has really made us all different. Through that examination of trads, though, on the various social media platforms, it shows how digital media has reworked authority in Catholic communities in the US. So on one hand, the expansion of access and ability, to produce content online has undermined the power of Catholic leadership in some ways, right? Enabling lay Catholics to sort of shape their own Catholic identity and culture and practice, which was happening before the internet era, to be sure. I mean, Catholics in some sense have always done this, especially American Catholics. But hyperconnectivity has only sort of accelerated that process in every way, right? Both in time and in impact. And then on the other hand, though, digital hyperconnectivity isn't this like democratizing thing, right? That's just democratized Catholic communities and made everybody have this equal voice or whatever. It's also, algorithmic culture and the platformatization of creativity has further concentrated cultural power in many ways. So it sort of just unpacks these changes in authority and how authority works and how digital hyperconnectivity has changed that. So it sort of adds that to the conversation with a focus on Catholics. So that's what I'm working on right now. I'm also working on an article that thinks about this term Christian nationalism and sort of problematizes it a little bit, kind of coming at it from a critical perspective. So I hope that comes out. So with those two things, because they are, about contemporary stuff that a lot of people are interested in, I'm hoping to pair those with some more public facing pieces. So I have a couple of podcast episodes in the works. I have I'd like to publish more stuff on outlets like Religion Dispatches or RNS or The Conversation, places like that, to sort of translate what I'm doing in the book to a more public audience who might be interested in some of these conversations.
Fabulous. Where can people find you if they want to follow along with what you got going on?
Yes. So I always keep my LSU webpage open. I have a website, laurenhorngriffin.com. You can find me there. For now, you can find me tweeting at Lauren Horngriff. I don't know how much longer I'll be around on Twitter, but I'm there for now.
Dr. Lauren Horn Griffin, thank you so much for coming on Classical Ideas. I have absolutely loved hearing about your split personality within your work, your interest in the early modern England, your focus on the here and now with the traditionalist Catholic movements in the U.S. Looking forward to seeing more of your work in the future. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.